The silence in the courtroom was heavy. People leaned forward, breaths caught, as if the weight of every whispered rumor in America had just been condensed into one man's trembling lips. Then came the words no one expected. It wasn't just me. It was a planned hit. Imagine hearing that from the very person accused of killing a nationally recognized political activist. Imagine the walls of that courtroom vibrating with shock. Every reporter's pen scratching furiously, every pair of eyes darting to see how the judge would react. And imagine, for a moment, how different everything suddenly felt. This wasn't just a murder trial anymore. This was something far bigger. But let's rewind. Before we get lost in conspiracies and unanswered questions, let's step into the heart of the story. Because what happened that day in Orem, Utah, has already carved itself into American history. The scene, Utah Valley University. Bright lights, a buzzing crowd, the open-air atmosphere charged with the intensity of politics, activism, and passion. Charlie Kirk, 31 years old, co-founder of Turning Point USA, stood at the center of it all. He had faced protests before. He had handled hecklers, loud chants, even threats. But nothing prepared him, or anyone there, for the bullet that silenced him forever. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The sound was deafening. A single crack, then chaos. Screams. Panic. People hitting the ground, others rushing for cover. Some froze, stunned, unable to comprehend what had just unfolded in front of their eyes. And in those seconds, as Kirk collapsed, the entire event turned from hopeful activism into a crime scene drenched in confusion and horror. Have you ever noticed how quickly joy can morph into fear? 1 second, applause. The next, blood on the pavement. The world of American politics has always been explosive, but rarely does it get this literal. Which is why what happened next wasn't just about one man's death. It was about what his death might symbolize. Because if Charlie Kirk was truly targeted, not by accident, not by a lone wolf, but by an organized, deliberate plan, then the question isn't just who killed him. It becomes, who wanted him gone and why? Let me ask you this directly. Do you believe in coincidences? Or are you one of those people who suspects that when powerful voices are silenced, there's always a hidden hand pulling the strings? Now, the investigators wasted no time. Within days, FBI Director Kash Patel stood in front of cameras with chilling evidence. DNA on a screwdriver, DNA on a towel wrapped around the weapon. Think about that detail for a second. A rifle, wrapped in a towel. That doesn't sound like a panicked shooter stumbling into a crime. That sounds like someone prepared, someone who knew exactly how to conceal and transport a deadly weapon, doesn't it? And when Patel confirmed the DNA matched Tyler Robinson, a 22-year-old, the headlines erupted. Suddenly, everyone had a villain, a face to plaster on screens, a name to curse. But here's where things get strange. Robinson didn't confess. He didn't cry. He didn't even cooperate. According to Utah's governor, Spencer Cox, Robinson clammed up, silent, unmoving, almost as if he was trained, or told, not to say a word. Isn't that odd? Most people accused of something this massive either deny it passionately or lash out emotionally. But Robinson did neither. Instead, he waited, patiently, until court. And that's when the silence broke. Picture it, the defendant rising, eyes cold, voice steady, and saying words that turned the courtroom upside down. It wasn't just me. 5 words. Enough to ignite a storm of theories. Then came the dagger. It was a planned hit. You could hear the gasp ripple across the room. Because with that one statement, the entire trial shifted from a straightforward murder case into something resembling a political thriller. But here's the kicker. He refused to name names. He hinted at powerful backers, a shadowy network, but he clammed up again when pressed for details. Why? Was he protecting someone? Was he afraid? Or was this his way of taunting the system, dangling a piece of the puzzle just out of reach? Think about the timing. Think about the message. Charlie Kirk wasn't just an activist. He was a symbol, a lightning rod in American politics. Silencing him sends a message. But to whom? To conservatives? To young activists? To America itself? This is why this story matters right now. Because we are living in a time where conspiracy and reality often blur, where truth feels slippery, and where one man's death could ripple across the political landscape for years. If Robinson is telling the truth, then this isn't just about one man pulling a trigger. It's about the machinery behind him. A machine that wanted Charlie Kirk gone. But let me stop here and ask you, what would you do if you knew names? If you knew who gave the order? Would you say them aloud, risking your own life? Or would you, like Robinson, stay silent, letting the world speculate? Because silence, in cases like this, can be louder than screams. And so we sit here, in the aftermath of his shocking words, staring at the unanswered questions. Was this truly a political assassination? Who are these powerful backers? And why does Robinson continue to hide behind his silence? But here's the real cliffhanger. This is only the beginning. Because as we dig deeper, what investigators uncovered next on that rooftop, and what Robinson's past reveals, might just change everything we thought we knew about this case. The day of the murder. It started like so many other events. A university campus buzzing with energy. Students laughing, professors hurrying to their offices, activists setting up signs, security keeping watch over a crowd that was larger than usual. The air was crisp, the kind of sharp Utah morning where the sky feels impossibly blue, and you can almost forget for a moment that the world outside is burning with political division. Almost. Charlie Kirk had been in situations like this before. The co-founder of Turning Point USA, he thrived on confrontation, on debate, on standing in front of a crowd and making his case. To his supporters, he was a truth-teller, a fearless warrior for conservative values. To his critics, he was inflammatory, a provocateur. But one thing was certain, he was never ignored. People came to see him whether they loved him or hated him. And that Wednesday in Orem, Utah, was no different. Picture the stage, an open-air platform, banners fluttering in the breeze, microphones adjusted just so. The crowd swelled, restless but eager, smartphones in hand, ready to record every word. Security swept the area, scanning rooftops, checking corners, doing what they could to manage the unpredictable. But no security is ever foolproof, is it? Not when someone is determined. Not when a plan is in motion long before the first speech begins. Charlie took the stage. Applause erupted, cheers rang out. A few jeers from protesters cut through, but the energy was electric. He leaned into the mic, started to speak, and for a brief moment, the chaos of America's political battleground melted into a single moment of clarity. He was in his element. And then, the sound. A crack. Sharp, violent, unmistakable. At first, some thought it was fireworks. Others froze, their brains refusing to connect the sound with reality. But then came the screaming. Panic rippled through the crowd like a wave. People ducked, stumbled, shoved. Cell phones tumbled to the ground. Signs were trampled. Children cried. And in the middle of it all, Charlie Kirk collapsed. The bullet had found its mark. The chaos that followed is almost impossible to describe unless you've been in such a moment. Blood mixing with dirt. Supporters rushing forward, some trying desperately to help, others screaming for medics. The smell of gunpowder still hanging in the air. And over it all, the raw, primal sound of fear. But as people scattered and police swarmed, another drama was unfolding just above their heads. Because the shooter hadn't disappeared into thin air. Evidence, left behind in haste, or maybe with intention, waited on a rooftop. A screwdriver, a dark towel wrapped around a rifle. And with it, a chilling truth. This wasn't some impulsive act. This was deliberate, calculated, planned. And doesn't that word, planned, send a chill down your spine? Think about it. The choice of location, the timing, the preparation to wrap and conceal the weapon. This wasn't the action of someone stumbling into madness. This was execution, pure and cold. But as investigators swept the scene, while ambulances rushed away and television stations scrambled to cover breaking news, another name began to surface. Tyler Robinson, a 22-year-old. Not a famous face, not a household name, but suddenly the most infamous man in America. How did they get to him so quickly? Because of that rooftop. Because of the DNA trail that tied him to the crime. Because no matter how carefully you plan, no matter how calculated your moves, something always gets left behind. And that's the paradox of crime, isn't it? The more perfect the plan, the more likely it is to unravel with a single mistake. But in that moment, before the arrest, before the courtroom drama, before the whispers of conspiracy, America stood still. A political activist had been murdered in broad daylight at a university. And the question wasn't just, who fired the shot? It was why. Why here? Why now? Why him? Because when bullets fly, they don't just tear through flesh. They rip through trust, through safety, through the illusion that political debate, no matter how heated, can remain peaceful. And for Charlie Kirk supporters, the shot was more than a crime. It was a message. But from whom? The crowd that day will never forget the sight. Some still have nightmares of that moment, the split second where applause turned into terror. Some still hear the echo of that gunshot in their heads. And maybe you're wondering right now, how did it all come together so perfectly for the killer? Because what if it wasn't just one man acting alone? What if the plan had been set long before the first word left Charlie's lips that day? And what investigators discovered in the hours immediately after the shooting suggested exactly that. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The rooftop. That's where the trail truly began to make sense. Or at least, that's where investigators thought it did. Picture it. Police tape flapping in the breeze. Officers combing through every inch of the scene. Reporters swarming the perimeter. Cameras zooming in from blocks away. The ground where Charlie Kirk fell was chaotic, but above, hidden from the screaming crowd, was a treasure trove of evidence that would set this case apart from almost any other. On that rooftop, investigators found what looked at first like random debris. A dark-colored towel. A screwdriver. To the untrained eye, nothing extraordinary. But to forensic experts, they screamed of intent. They screamed of planning. They screamed of someone who hadn't just pulled a trigger in a fit of rage, but who had prepared for this moment with chilling precision. The rifle, wrapped in that towel, wasn't just a weapon. It was a statement. Imagine carefully wrapping a firearm, concealing it from view, ensuring it could be carried, moved, and hidden without raising alarms. This wasn't the mark of an amateur. This was someone who thought ahead. And the screwdriver? It suggested tampering, setup, maybe even modification of equipment. Whoever left these items wasn't careless. They were tactical. But here's where it gets haunting. DNA doesn't lie. FBI Director Kash Patel would later confirm what everyone suspected. Tyler Robinson's DNA was on both the towel and the screwdriver. Two separate objects. Two separate connections. Think about how damning that is. It wasn't just a fingerprint brushed off by accident. It was biological evidence on multiple tools tied directly to the crime. The chance of coincidence? Practically zero. Now, let me ask you this. Doesn't that almost feel too clean? Too perfect? How often do investigators find such clear evidence, gift-wrapped and waiting? Was Robinson sloppy? Or was this part of a larger story? Maybe even evidence meant to point straight at him? Because here's where suspicion begins to seep in. Some observers have whispered that Robinson was too young, too inexperienced, to pull off something so elaborate alone. Could he really have staged the rifle, planned the rooftop vantage point, wrapped the weapon, and still had the presence of mind to execute such a high-profile hit? Or was someone guiding him? Someone with experience? Someone with a bigger agenda? The discovery of the DNA evidence immediately shifted the tone of the investigation. Within hours, the headlines weren't about a tragic shooting. They were about a suspect. Tyler Robinson's name was everywhere. His face plastered on screens. His background scrutinized. His silence dissected. And the towel and screwdriver? They became almost symbolic. They told a story of intent, precision, and most terrifying of all, planning. But let's pause and picture that rooftop again. Alone, quiet, overlooked by thousands below. The perfect vantage point. A shooter's nest. Think about the psychology of it. Standing above your target, looking down, watching the crowd cheer and laugh, all while holding the power of life and death in your hands. That isn't just a crime. That's theater. And the rooftop was the stage. And when Kash Patel stepped onto national television and confirmed that the DNA matched, it wasn't just an update. It was a revelation. I can report today, he said, that the DNA hits from the towel that was wrapped around the firearm and the DNA on the screwdriver are positively processed for the suspect in custody. Calm. Clinical. But beneath his words was a storm. Because DNA ties Robinson to the crime. But DNA doesn't explain motive. DNA doesn't explain why a 22-year-old would target a nationally known political activist. DNA doesn't explain why Robinson, once arrested, refused to speak. And isn't that the strangest part? Most killers, Even the most hardened have something to say. Rage, excuses, a twisted justification. But Robinson? Nothing. Silence. As if someone had told him long before, say nothing, do nothing, we'll handle the rest. The rooftop evidence closed the gap for investigators, but it opened a canyon of questions for the public. Was Robinson truly the mastermind, or just the trigger finger in a game much bigger than himself? Because here's the thing, perfect evidence doesn't always mean a perfect case. Sometimes, it means someone wanted the case to look perfect. And when Robinson finally broke his silence in court, his words would confirm those fears in ways that no one could have predicted. But the path to that moment started here, on a rooftop, with a towel, a screwdriver, and a chilling realization. This was no random act. And what investigators uncovered about Robinson himself, the man behind the DNA, would shake the nation even further. The arrest. It didn't happen quietly. It didn't happen in some shadowy alleyway or hidden basement. No. The arrest of Tyler Robinson unfolded like something out of a crime drama, the kind of moment where cameras roll, sirens wail, and neighbors peek from behind curtains as if history itself is passing by their windows. Because when law enforcement finally closed in on the 22-year-old accused of killing Charlie Kirk, the world was already watching, hungry for answers. Robinson had been under surveillance almost from the moment the DNA match came back. Investigators had combed through his background, where he lived, where he worked, who he associated with. They didn't just want to capture him, they wanted to understand him. And when they finally moved in, they did so with precision. No risks, no mistakes. A suspect like this wasn't just dangerous, he was symbolic. If he slipped away, if he resisted, the fallout would be catastrophic. Picture the scene. Armored vehicles rolling into a quiet neighborhood, officers shouting commands, helicopters circling overhead. Residents filmed on their phones, their voices hushed with fear and awe. And in the middle of it all, Tyler Robinson. Hands cuffed behind his back, head down, face unreadable. No anger, no panic, no outburst of innocence. Just silence. And isn't that strange? Shouldn't a 22-year-old, suddenly accused of the most high-profile murder in the nation, be screaming? Shouldn't he be insisting he was framed, begging for mercy, crying out for his parents, anyone? But Robinson said nothing. That silence was louder than a confession. Governor Spencer Cox would later confirm that Robinson refused to cooperate, refused to confess, refused even to acknowledge the mountain of evidence stacked against him. It was as if the arrest wasn't an ending, but the beginning of something much darker. Doesn't that chill you? Neighbors described him as quiet, unassuming, even polite. No one saw this coming. Isn't that always the story? The quiet ones, the ones who blend in. But there was something in his stillness during that arrest that didn't sit right with people. He didn't look broken. He didn't look confused. He looked prepared, almost as if he had been waiting for this moment. And then came the perp walk. The cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions. Did you do it? Why Charlie Kirk? Who ordered you? Robinson didn't flinch, didn't blink. He kept his head lowered, his lips sealed. That refusal to play into the media's game turned him into an enigma overnight. To some, it screamed guilt. To others, it whispered something far more sinister, that he was protecting someone. And here's the question that keeps echoing. How does a 22-year-old, with no public history of extreme violence, end up at the center of an assassination-style killing? Was this radicalization? Was this manipulation? Or was this a pawn doing the bidding of invisible hands? The arrest gave investigators their man, but it didn't give America its answers. In fact, it only deepened the mystery. Because while the evidence pointed to Robinson, his silence suggested there was more beneath the surface. And when a suspect refuses to defend themselves, refuses to speak, refuses even to deny, it leaves only two possibilities. Either he is so consumed by guilt that words no longer matter, or he knows something so dangerous, so explosive, that silence is his only shield. And isn't it curious that, from the moment of his arrest, whispers of conspiracy began to spread, as if people sensed instinctively that this wasn't just about one man and one bullet. This was about something bigger. The nation had its suspect. The law had its prisoner. But the truth? That was still locked away, buried in Tyler Robinson's silence. And it would take a courtroom, a jury, and a single shocking revelation to crack it open. Because when Robinson finally spoke, what he said would shake the foundations of the trial and the country. But no one, not even the judge, was ready for the storm his words unleashed. The courtroom. There's a hush that falls over a room just before something historic is said. You can almost feel the tension in your bones, the weight of silence pressing down on your chest. That was the atmosphere as Tyler Robinson, the man accused of killing Charlie Kirk, finally stood in court. Journalists filled every seat, pens poised, cameras ready. Family members clutched tissues, supporters of Kirk braced themselves, and critics leaned forward, eager to hear what would finally come from the accused. And then he spoke. It wasn't just me. It was a planned hit. The words sliced through the silence like a blade. Imagine being there. The collective gasp. The murmurs rippling through the gallery. The judge banging the gavel, calling for order as voices rose, people whispering. Did he just say what I think he said? Because in an instant, the trial shifted. This wasn't just about a lone shooter anymore. This wasn't just about vengeance or madness. Robinson himself was claiming he wasn't alone, that he had been ordered, instructed, backed by others. Think about the gravity of that statement. For months, investigators had painted a picture of one man, one gun, one motive. But now, in a single chilling declaration, Robinson was pulling back the curtain on something far more sinister: conspiracy. Let me ask you directly, what would you have done in that moment if you were sitting in that courtroom? Would you believe him? Or would you think he was lying, trying to save himself from the death penalty by sowing doubt? The prosecutor froze, pin dangling midair. The defense attorney looked as if they wanted to vanish. Even the judge, usually a stone wall of procedure and authority, blinked, taken aback. Courtrooms thrive on predictability. Objections, motions, testimonies, they follow a rhythm. But Robinson's words shattered that rhythm. It was a planned hit. He didn't scream it. He didn't weep it. He said it with a steady voice, calm and deliberate, as if he'd been rehearsing it for weeks. That composure made it even more chilling, because it didn't sound like desperation. It sounded like truth. And then came the questions. Who ordered it? The prosecutor demanded. Robinson just stared. Who are you protecting? The judge pressed. Still silence. That was the maddening part. He gave enough to ignite a firestorm, but refused to pour water on the flames. He dropped the bombshell, then clammed up, refusing to provide names, details, or proof. Why? Was he scared? Was he bound by loyalty? Or was this his way of taunting the system? Giving just enough to stir chaos, but not enough to pin down anyone else. And here's where the emotional tension peaked. Charlie Kirk's family sat in the front row. Imagine the torment of hearing those words. Imagine being told your son, your brother, your friend wasn't just murdered by a single man, but by a shadowy network that ordered the hit. Imagine the rage of not knowing who gave that order. Imagine the helplessness of hearing silence instead of answers. Reporters raced to publish headlines within minutes. Robinson claims political hit. Courtroom erupts over assassination allegation. Social media exploded. Hashtags trended. Conspiracy theories multiplied. Was Kirk targeted because of his activism? Was this about silencing conservative voices? Was it revenge? Or was it, as some wild theories suggested, a warning shot to America itself? And yet, Robinson refused to elaborate. The judge threatened contempt. Prosecutors tried to corner him. Defense counsel begged him to stop. But Robinson remained unmoved. He had said what he came to say, and in that stillness, in that refusal to reveal more, the mystery grew even darker. Here's a question for you. Do you think silence can be more dangerous than words? Because in Robinson's silence, people began to imagine their own truths. Some believed him. Some thought it was all manipulation. Some saw him as a pawn, others as a mastermind. But everyone agreed on one thing. This case was no longer simple. The courtroom that day became more than a place of law. It became a theater of fear, speculation, and political shockwaves. And when Robinson finally sat down, refusing to answer another question, it was as if the air itself had shifted. This was no longer just the trial of Tyler Robinson. This was a trial of truth. But if Robinson wasn't lying, if it really was a planned hit, then the most haunting question of all still lingers. Who are the powerful backers hiding in the shadows? And the next step in uncovering that possibility would take us deeper into the dangerous world of political conspiracy, where history itself offers chilling parallels. The political conspiracy angle. What if Charlie Kirk's death wasn't about one man with a gun, but about silencing a voice? That's the question that hung in the air after Robinson's shocking declaration. It was a planned hit. 3 words that transformed a murder case into a possible political earthquake. Suddenly, commentators weren't just asking who pulled the trigger. They were asking why Kirk. And if he was the target, who wanted him gone? Charlie Kirk was no ordinary activist. At just 31, he had built a brand, a movement, a loyal following through Turning Point USA. To his supporters, he was a hero, a bold defender of free speech and conservative ideals. To his critics, he was dangerous, a provocateur who thrived on controversy. Doesn't that sound familiar? Haven't we seen throughout history that those who provoke the loudest reactions, whether love or hate, often become targets? Let's step back for a moment. Political assassinations, or even just the suspicion of them, have always carried the power to destabilize societies. Think of John F. Kennedy in Dallas, 1963. Think of Martin Luther King Jr. in Memphis, 1968. Think of leaders across the globe, Benazir Bhutto, Yitzhak Rabin, Salvador Allende. The names differ, the countries differ, but the pattern remains. Voices of influence, voices that shake the system, suddenly cut short. And what do we hear in the aftermath? Always the same. Was it really just one man? Or was there a hidden hand? That's why Robinson's words struck so deep. They tapped into a historical wound, a fear that behind every lone shooter lies an invisible machine. Consider Kirk's profile. He wasn't just any activist. He spoke on college campuses, challenging liberal orthodoxy. He pushed boundaries, mocked establishment politics, and built an empire of influence among America's youth. Now ask yourself, who gains from removing someone like that? Who benefits from silencing a man who could inspire the next generation of conservative leaders? But here's the chilling contradiction. While Robinson insisted it was planned, he refused to name names. And isn't that almost worse? Because silence breeds speculation. It gives oxygen to conspiracy. In the absence of answers, people filled the void with theories. Some pointed to political rivals, those who had long wanted Kirk silenced. Others whispered about foreign influence, the possibility of outside actors meddling in America's ideological wars. Still others suggested it was a message from within, a punishment not for what Kirk stood against, but for what he might one day expose. And you, watching this, what do you think? Was Kirk targeted because of his message? Or was he simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? But here's where it gets even darker. Robinson's calm delivery in court didn't feel like desperation. It felt rehearsed, as though he knew exactly how much to reveal and exactly how much to withhold. And that raises the terrifying possibility. Was his statement itself part of the plan? Was Robinson instructed not just to pull the trigger, but to plant the seed of conspiracy, to leave the country spinning in paranoia? Let's not forget the towel, the screwdriver, the DNA trail. They pointed to him, yes, but they also painted a picture of professionalism. How does a 22-year-old get that meticulous without training, without backing, without someone showing him exactly what to do? This is where history becomes instructive again. The concept of the lone wolf is convenient. It ties the bow neatly. It allows society to breathe again, to say, one crazy man, one act, nothing more. But what if the lone wolf isn't lone at all? What if he's just the visible piece of a much larger pack hiding in the shadows? Robinson may never answer those questions directly. Maybe he can't. Maybe he fears the consequences. Or maybe he knows that saying too much would end his life before the state ever gets the chance. And that's why this chapter in the trial matters so much. Because it forces us, as observers, to ask the unthinkable. Was Charlie Kirk's death the result of one man's choice, or the culmination of a broader conspiracy with motives far beyond anything we can see in the courtroom? But here's the cliffhanger. The conspiracy doesn't end with Robinson's words. Because when investigators started digging deeper into his connections, his past, and the people around him, what they found suggested he may not have been as alone as prosecutors wanted the public to believe. And those potential connections, those shadowy hints of a network, would make the story even more explosive. The shadowy network. Robinson's words had already set the court ablaze, but the echoes didn't stop there. Once he hinted that this was bigger than him, that powerful backers had ordered the hit, the natural question was, who? Who stood behind him? Who pulled the strings? Because every assassin, every pawn, every trigger puller has to have someone holding the leash. The FBI dug. Journalists dug. Social media exploded with theories. And slowly, like smoke rising from a hidden fire, patterns began to emerge. Let's start with the obvious. Robinson wasn't wealthy. He didn't have the resources to plan something this meticulous alone. Rifles, tools, transport, the kind of careful setup seen on that rooftop. It all requires money, training, or both. So where did it come from? Was someone supplying him? Coaching him? Protecting him? Because doesn't it feel too clean, too professional, for a 22-year-old acting solo? Think about the towel again. That rifle wasn't shoved into a backpack. It was wrapped, concealed, moved in silence. That kind of detail doesn't scream spontaneous. It screams planning, instruction, someone teaching him the steps. And here's where the whispers turned into roars. Rumors swirled about cells of politically motivated actors, networks of extremists operating quietly behind the scenes. To some, Robinson was their first visible soldier. To others, he was just a patsy, someone chosen because he could be tied directly to the scene, while the true mastermind stayed hidden in the dark. Which theory do you believe? But one thing is undeniable. Conspiracies thrive when the facts are scarce. And Robinson gave the world just enough to feed that fire. It wasn't just me. He didn't have to name names. By refusing to elaborate, he forced everyone else to fill in the blanks. And that is where paranoia grows. Look back through history. The assassination of Julius Caesar. The killing of Abraham Lincoln. The shots that killed Kennedy. Do you see the thread? Rarely does society accept the lone man with a weapon story. We crave the bigger picture. We suspect networks, cabals, powerful figures lurking just outside the frame. Because power attracts enemies, and enemies rarely strike alone. So what about Charlie Kirk? His rise made him a lightning rod. His speeches challenged liberal strongholds on campuses, clashing with some of the most progressive institutions in America. Was his assassination a message? Was it punishment? Or was it a calculated move by a network determined to silence his growing influence? Now, pause for a second. Imagine you're Robinson. You're sitting in a jail cell. You've just told the world this was bigger than you. Why not name names? Why not spill it all? Unless speaking the truth would guarantee your own death before you ever reach sentencing. Unless the shadowy backers you hinted at aren't just powerful, they're untouchable. Isn't that the true horror? That the silence itself may be proof of the threat? And here's another chilling layer. Some of Robinson's past connections, when investigators began peeling them back, hinted at strange alliances. Online groups, late-night encrypted chats, meetings with people he never should have known. Each thread suggested that he wasn't living in isolation. He was moving in circles far more dangerous than anyone imagined. But the court didn't get those names. The public didn't get those details. Instead, Robinson gave a sliver of truth and then sealed his lips. Enough to ignite chaos. Enough to make the world suspicious. Enough to let 1,000 theories bloom. But not enough to point the finger at anyone specific. And maybe that was the point. Maybe Robinson knew he didn't have to prove a network existed. All he had to do was suggest it, and the paranoia would take care of the rest. So now, we're left to wonder. Who were the powerful backers? Politicians? Foreign agents? Extremist groups? Or was Robinson lying, manipulating the world for his own twisted amusement? The truth is locked in his silence. But investigators weren't ready to stop there. Because even as the court reeled, the media storm outside was about to explode. And what happened next would turn this case into a full-blown national crisis. Because when the story hit the airwaves, it stopped being about one man's words. It became a war of narratives. And the media firestorm that followed would push this case into every home in America. The media firestorm. It didn't take hours. It didn't even take minutes. Within seconds of Robinson's courtroom words, it was a planned hit. The outside world lit up like a dry forest set ablaze. Reporters scrambled out of the courthouse, clutching their phones, yelling into microphones, desperate to be the first to deliver the bombshell. The story wasn't just breaking, it was detonating. Cable news anchors interrupted programming mid-sentence. "We have breaking news out of Utah." The Chiron appeared. Robinson claims Kirk murder was planned hit. Social media platforms turned into battlefields. Hashtags surged, opinions flooded, and within an hour, the story wasn't just national. It was global. And here's the thing about the media. Facts are currency, but emotion is gold. Reporters didn't just deliver the words. They delivered shock, fear, speculation. Each outlet spun it differently. Conservative commentators thundered that Kirk had been assassinated for his politics, that this was proof of war against their voices. Liberal pundits warned against falling for conspiratorial ploys and insisted Robinson was manipulating the narrative to save himself. But no matter the angle, everyone agreed. This wasn't simple anymore. Now, think about how quickly news travels today. One clip of Robinson in court, eyes steady, voice calm, saying it was a planned hit, was shared millions of times within hours. TikTok users dissected his body language. YouTube commentators went live, streaming for hours, asking their audiences, who are the powerful backers he's talking about? Twitter threads unraveled like investigative novels, piecing together theories from scraps of information. Doesn't that tell you something about us? That when answers are missing, we'll invent our own? And let's not forget the role of irony here. Charlie Kirk, a man who built his empire on using media to amplify his voice, became the centerpiece of a media hurricane in death. His murder wasn't just a crime, it was content. It was headlines, ratings, views, shares. And while his supporters wept, his name climbed the algorithm. But the firestorm didn't stop with speculation. Politicians seized the moment. Speeches in Congress, emergency press briefings, statements filled with outrage and warning. Some demanded swift justice, others demanded transparency, and still others leaned into conspiracy, fanning flames rather than calming them. After all, what's more politically valuable than a mystery that can be bent to fit your agenda? Now, pause here and ask yourself, do you trust the media? Do you believe the stories you're fed? Or do you suspect, deep down, that you're being guided toward a conclusion someone else wants you to reach? Because in this case, both sides accused the other of spinning the narrative. And meanwhile, Robinson sat in silence, saying nothing, letting the world devour itself over his words. That silence was power. The firestorm grew so intense that people began to report feeling unsafe. Protesters gathered outside courthouses. Candlelight vigils were interrupted by counter-protests. Cities thousands of miles away erupted in rallies, chants, and even violence, all sparked by a single man's refusal to tell the whole truth. And here's the kicker. International outlets picked it up too. In London, in Paris, in Tokyo, headlines screamed about the planned hit of a U.S. political figure. Foreign analysts speculated openly about whether America had entered a new era of politically motivated killings. And isn't it terrifying that one phrase, spoken in one courtroom, could ripple across oceans and shape global perceptions of American democracy? But this firestorm wasn't just chaos. It was also pressure. Pressure on investigators. Pressure on prosecutors. Pressure on the governor of Utah to say something, anything, to calm the storm. And when Governor Spencer Cox finally stepped to a podium, cameras flashing, his words would pour gasoline on an already raging blaze. Because the governor didn't offer comfort. He didn't offer clarity. Instead, he admitted Robinson wasn't cooperating, wasn't confessing, wasn't giving answers. And that simple truth made the conspiracy seem all the more real. The governor speaks. When Governor Spencer Cox finally faced the cameras, the nation held its breath. The pressure on him was unbearable, protests swelling, media in frenzy, and a courtroom revelation still echoing across America. People expected answers, reassurance, maybe even calm. But what they got was something else entirely. Cox looked stern, almost shaken. He cleared his throat, leaned into the microphone, and admitted the one thing no one wanted to hear. Tyler Robinson wasn't cooperating. Think about how heavy those words are. A man accused of murdering Charlie Kirk, a man whose DNA was tied to the weapon, a man who admitted in open. And that silence terrified people. Because silence means uncertainty. It means there are things we don't know, things hiding in the shadows. If Robinson was lying, why not admit it under questioning? If he was telling the truth, why not protect himself by exposing the names of those who ordered him? Instead, he left America hanging in a purgatory of suspicion. Cox's statement was meant to show strength, but instead, it rattled the public. Imagine being the family of Charlie Kirk, sitting at home, waiting desperately for justice, only to hear the governor admit the accused won't talk. Imagine being one of Kirk's supporters, marching in the streets, only to hear that no progress was being made. Doesn't it feel like pouring salt into an open wound? The media latched onto Cox's words instantly. Robinson not cooperating. Governor confirms suspect silent. Headlines spread like wildfire. Social media seized on it. Memes mocking the silence, threads speculating about death threats, videos theorizing about backroom deals keeping Robinson's lips sealed. And here's the irony. Cox probably thought he was being transparent, trying to calm the storm with honesty. Instead, his statement deepened the paranoia. Because now the silence wasn't just Robinson's problem, it was the state's. People began to ask, is Robinson staying silent on his own, or is someone making sure he stays silent? That question ignited a new wave of theories. Some argued he was scared of retribution, that naming his backers would mean instant retaliation, maybe even from inside prison walls. Others whispered that powerful figures had already reached him, offering protection, deals, or threats. Still others claimed his silence was part of the plan from the very beginning, a tactic designed to leave America guessing forever. Let me put the question to you directly. If you were Robinson, sitting in a jail cell with the death penalty looming, would you stay silent? Or would you scream the names of those who ordered you, desperate to save your own life? Because doesn't it feel like silence in this case isn't weakness, it's power? Cox's words carried another unintended consequence. They pushed the courtroom drama into the streets. Protests grew louder. Some demanded transparency, some demanded vengeance, and some demanded answers that no one seemed able to provide. The governor's office was flooded with calls. National leaders began weighing in, urging patience, urging justice, urging truth. But the truth was locked away in Robinson's mind, and no one, not even the governor of Utah, could pry it out. And that's what made this moment so explosive. Because if the highest authority in the state admitted he couldn't break Robinson's silence, then who could? And if no one could, what did that mean about the conspiracy Robinson had teased in court? It meant one thing. If Robinson really was ordered to kill Charlie Kirk, the people behind it were still out there. Free, untouched, watching. And that chilling thought led to the next chapter of the trial. The brutal reality of what Robinson was facing under the law, and the deadly stakes that made his silence even more haunting. Because the charges weren't ordinary. They carried the ultimate punishment. And as the legal stakes came into focus, the fear only deepened. Aggravated murder. Felony discharge of a firearm causing serious bodily injury. Obstruction of justice. Each word in that list is heavy enough to crush a man's future, but together, they form something far more terrifying. The possibility of the death penalty in Utah. When prosecutors announced the charges, they weren't just throwing the book at Tyler Robinson. They were sending a message. This wasn't an ordinary case. This wasn't a brawl gone wrong, a robbery that escalated, or a tragic accident. This was the deliberate killing of a nationally known political activist in broad daylight on a university campus. The severity demanded the harshest of responses. And so, Robinson now stood at the edge of two possible futures: life behind bars with no hope of release, or a needle in his arm as the state carried out the ultimate sentence. Both options carry their own kind of terror. Life means decades in a concrete box, silence his only companion. Death means an abrupt ending, a finality that no appeal, no theory, no whisper of conspiracy can undo. But here's the twist. For many people, the looming punishment wasn't just about Robinson. It was about the story he refused to tell. Because if he truly was ordered by powerful backers, then killing him through legal execution would also kill the chance of ever uncovering their names. Wouldn't it? That irony hit hard. On one hand, justice demanded retribution for the brutal killing of Charlie Kirk. On the other, truth demanded Robinson stay alive long enough to reveal who, if anyone, was pulling his strings. Which would you choose? Justice or truth? Now, let's dig into what aggravated murder really means in Utah. It's not just murder. It's murder with special circumstances that elevate it to the most serious charge possible. Things like killing a public figure, planning the act in advance, or committing it in a particularly heinous way. Robinson's case checked nearly every box. Public figure? Check. Planned hit. By his own admission. Heinous execution? Absolutely. The law was stacked against him, and prosecutors wasted no time reminding the jury, the press, and the public of that fact. They painted Robinson as cold, calculating, a man who chose his moment and executed it with chilling precision. They argued he wasn't just guilty, he was dangerous, and the only way to protect society was to erase him from it. But then came the defense. What do you say when your client has already admitted to the act? When DNA evidence ties him directly to the weapon? You grasp for the gray areas. You raise questions about his mental state. You point to coercion, manipulation, the possibility that he wasn't truly acting of his own free will. And wasn't that exactly what Robinson himself implied? That he wasn't the sole architect of this crime? The defense leaned into that possibility. Maybe he was pressured. Maybe he was ordered. Maybe he was just a pawn. And doesn't that make you think, if he really was just a pawn, is the death penalty justice? Or is it simply the erasure of the one person who could expose the players behind the curtain? But here's where the contradictions cut deep. Robinson refused to give names, refused to provide evidence of these supposed backers. Without proof, his claim could be dismissed as a desperate ploy. Yet without his cooperation, prosecutors couldn't disprove it either. He left the court suspended in uncertainty, and that uncertainty gnawed at everyone watching. And what about the emotional toll? Charlie Kirk's family demanded justice. Supporters wanted blood. Put him away forever. Give him the death penalty. Their voices grew louder each day. But on the other side, civil rights advocates warned against rushing into execution. If he knows more, we need him alive. Two powerful, emotional forces pulling in opposite directions. And that's where the tension burned hottest. Was Robinson's silence an act of cowardice? Or was it his last line of survival in a world where speaking the truth might get him killed before the state ever could? The law had its path. The charges were set. The penalties clear. But the silence left a shadow over every proceeding. And as the judge prepared to move the case forward, everyone wondered, when Robinson finally faces his verdict, will justice be served or buried with him? But before we get there, before we reach sentencing and verdicts, we have to step into the mind of the man himself. Because understanding Robinson's psychology, his demeanor, his silence, his chilling composure, might just be the key to unlocking whether he was a mastermind or merely a puppet. Inside Robinson's mind, what goes through the head of a 22-year-old accused of killing a national figure? That's the question that haunted psychologists, journalists, and the public alike. Because when Tyler Robinson walked into that courtroom, he didn't look like a man crumbling under the weight of guilt. He didn't look like someone grasping for sympathy or bargaining for his life. No, he looked still, too still. His silence wasn't frantic or confused, it was calculated. His eyes stayed locked forward, his body stiff, his jaw clenched. No twitching, no tears, no pleading. It was as if he had rehearsed every movement. And doesn't that raise the most chilling possibility? That Robinson wasn't improvising, but playing a role in a script already written? Psychologists who studied the footage noted his lack of typical stress indicators. Most suspects facing capital charges exhibit anxiety, panic, or desperate attempts to shift blame. Robinson, by contrast, seemed almost resigned, as if he had already accepted his fate, or worse, as if his fate didn't matter. What does that tell you? Was he brainwashed? Manipulated? Or did he believe in something so deeply that death itself didn't scare him? Think about cults. Think about radicalized cells. History is filled with young men and women convinced to sacrifice themselves for a cause larger than their own lives. Robinson's blank demeanor fit that mold uncomfortably well. It suggested conviction. It suggested loyalty. It suggested that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't acting for himself at all. And yet, his calmness didn't come across as pride. There was no smirk, no satisfaction, just silence. The kind of silence that gnaws at observers because it leaves space for projection. Was he terrified? Was he loyal? Or was he playing cat and mouse with the system, enjoying the chaos he unleashed by saying just enough but not too much? Let me ask you directly. If you were in his shoes, with the world watching, would you shout the names of those who ordered you? Or would you keep them hidden, protecting something greater, even as your own life slipped away? But his psychology wasn't just visible in the courtroom. Investigators began digging into his past, hoping to find patterns that might explain his behavior. Teachers remembered him as quiet, often detached. Neighbors said he kept to himself, rarely socializing. Friends, or what few he had, described him as impressionable, easily swayed by stronger personalities. Doesn't that sound like the perfect profile of someone who could be recruited, shaped, molded into a pawn? Still, there were contradictions. Robinson wasn't a loner in the classic sense. He spent a lot of time online, moving in digital spaces where ideologies collide, where conspiracies thrive, where anger festers. Some investigators believe those digital footprints told the real story, that Robinson's mind was sculpted not in classrooms or neighborhoods, but in encrypted chat rooms and radical forums. If that's true, then his silence in court wasn't just fear. It was loyalty to an unseen community that still lurks in the shadows. And here's the detail that unsettled even hardened agents. Robinson didn't flinch when the death penalty was mentioned. Most men pale at the thought of their own execution. Robinson didn't blink. That unnerving composure made some investigators whisper among themselves, "He's not scared of dying." And isn't that the most terrifying kind of suspect? The one who feels he has nothing to lose? But there's another layer we can't ignore. Silence can also be manipulation. What if Robinson's blank demeanor wasn't loyalty, wasn't fear, but control? By saying nothing, he keeps the spotlight. By refusing to crack, he remains the axis on which the whole case spins. Maybe he enjoys it. Maybe the chaos is his power. So which is it? Pawn? Fanatic? Manipulator? The truth is locked inside his mind, and unless he chooses to share it, we may never know. But investigators weren't finished. They wanted to understand not just Robinson's demeanor, but his history, his past, his connections. Because if his silence was protecting someone, those answers might be hidden in the life he lived before that rooftop. And when they started peeling back his past, what they uncovered only deepened the sense that Robinson wasn't alone. Because sometimes, a man's past tells you more than his words ever could. The past uncovered. To understand Tyler Robinson, investigators knew they had to go backward. Into his childhood, his teenage years, his digital footprint, and his circle of acquaintances. Because silence in court is one thing, but a man's past often whispers the truths his present refuses to say. And Robinson's past? It was messy, contradictory, and chillingly suggestive of forces larger than himself. Let's start with where he came from. Robinson grew up in Utah, a state known for its tightly knit communities, its religious traditions, its quiet neighborhoods. On the surface, he was unremarkable. Teachers described him as polite but distant. Classmates remembered him as quiet, the kind of student who sat in the back of the room, doing just enough to pass, but never enough to stand out. Doesn't that sound like the archetype we've seen before? The invisible figure no one notices until it's too late? But dig deeper, and cracks begin to show. Robinson's family life was far from stable. Friends spoke of long stretches where he drifted between relatives, occasional stints on his own, and money always being tight. Economic instability can be a fertile ground for resentment. And resentment, left unchecked, festers. Was Robinson nursing a quiet grudge against the world? Or was he being groomed by voices offering him belonging he never found at home? Investigators combed through his digital life. And here's where things turned eerie. Robinson spent hours, sometimes whole nights, in online forums, many of them cloaked in anonymity, encrypted, hidden from public view. Threads about politics, about conspiracy theories, about revolution. Some of the usernames that interacted with him have since vanished, deleted, or scrubbed, as if they never existed. Doesn't that strike you as strange? His search history, pieced together by forensic teams, painted a chilling picture. Queries about political assassinations, articles about campus security vulnerabilities, even documents about ballistics and weapon concealment. For a 22-year-old, it was a disturbingly methodical rabbit hole. And the question investigators asked themselves over and over was, did he stumble into these dark corners of the internet on his own, or was someone guiding him step by step? Neighbors later recalled unusual visitors to his apartment. Men they didn't recognize, arriving late at night, staying only briefly, leaving quickly. Were they friends? Were they handlers? Or were they phantoms of paranoia, seen only because people now searched for meaning in hindsight? And then there were the financial red flags. Robinson, who had no steady job, suddenly made purchases that didn't align with his known income. Specialized tools, travel expenses, a rifle. Where did the money come from? Was someone funding him? Was the shadowy network he hinted at in court not just a metaphor, but a financial reality? But perhaps the most haunting discovery was in his personal writings. Scrawled notes on torn paper, fragments of thoughts investigators found in his room. Phrases like, not alone, orders must be followed, silence is protection. Words that sound less like the ramblings of a lone madman and more like the indoctrination of someone caught in a net. And here's the contradiction that gnawed at everyone. Those who knew him casually swore he was harmless, even meek. He couldn't hurt a fly, one old classmate said. But others, closer to him in his final months before the shooting, noticed changes. He grew colder, more withdrawn. He spoke in cryptic tones, as if he carried a secret he couldn't share. Doesn't that sound like someone being pulled into something beyond his control? All these threads, his instability, his online radicalization, his unexplained resources, his cryptic notes, point to a man who wasn't entirely in charge of his own path. Whether by choice or coercion, Tyler Robinson seemed shaped, directed, weaponized. And that makes his courtroom words all the more haunting. It wasn't just me. It was a planned hit. But if his past hinted at outside influence, then the consequences of Kirk's assassination weren't just personal or local. They were national. Because the ripples from that gunshot didn't stop in Utah. They spread across America, leaving communities divided, angry, and afraid. And what came next proved just how explosive those ripples could be. Because the national fallout would turn this case from a courtroom drama into a crisis that touched every corner of the country. The national fallout. When the gunshot echoed through Utah Valley University, it didn't just silence Charlie Kirk. It sent shockwaves across the entire country. Within hours, campuses, communities, and cities thousands of miles away felt the ripple effect. Because this wasn't just another act of violence. This was political. This was symbolic. And America, already divided, suddenly felt like a tinderbox waiting for the next spark. Supporters of Kirk mourned loudly and publicly. Vigils sprang up in Arizona, Texas, Florida, places where Turning Point USA's influence was strongest. Candles flickered, tears streamed, and speeches rang out, painting Kirk not just as a victim, but as a martyr. People called him a fighter silenced by shadowy powers, a man who stood for free speech and paid the ultimate price. Doesn't that kind of framing sound familiar? Haven't we seen throughout history how sudden deaths transform individuals into larger-than-life legends? But on the other side, Kirk's critics walked a more uncomfortable line. Some expressed condolences, yes, but others whispered that Kirk's style of activism, provocative, sharp, relentless, had invited violence. Those comments lit another firestorm. Supporters called them heartless, cruel, proof of bias. And suddenly, the argument wasn't just about one murder. It was about America's soul. Social media became a battlefield. On one side, Charlie Kirk was assassinated for his beliefs. On the other, don't fall for conspiracy bait. This is one man's crime. And in the middle, millions of Americans scrolling, reading, wondering, what if Robinson was telling the truth? Now add in the protests. Crowds gathered outside courthouses, state houses, even the Capitol in Washington. Some carried signs demanding justice for Kirk. Others demanded transparency, chanting, "Who ordered it?" The air was thick with anger and fear. Clashes erupted between opposing groups. Police lines formed. In some cities, the protests devolved into riots, storefronts shattered, fires set. Doesn't it show how fragile the nation already was? That one gunshot could unravel the thin fabric of peace? And here's the irony. Charlie Kirk built much of his platform on fiery debates, on bringing political discourse into the public square. After his death, that very discourse spilled into the streets in ways that blurred the line between debate and chaos. His life had been about rallying the youth, igniting activism. His death ignited something else entirely: fear. National leaders scrambled to respond. The White House issued a carefully worded statement, calling the murder a tragedy, while cautioning against fueling conspiracy theories. But that caution was ignored. Congress erupted with partisan finger-pointing. Some lawmakers called Kirk's death a political assassination. Others slammed those words as reckless, accusing their opponents of exploiting a tragedy for political gain. And in the